this is a cluster of crimes. It cannot be called a law enforcement operation because it was a criminal operation. And in criminal operations, the perpetrators, those who order it, those who follow the unlawful orders, they're supposed to be held accountable under the rule of law. But this is such a massive cluster of crimes. As I said, the sanctions imposed on Venezuela by the US, these are unilateral coercive measures under international law. They are unlawful. They violate the UN Charter and a whole raft of international human rights treaties that are binding on the United States. Also unlawful were the US supported coup attempts in 2002, in 2019, in 2020. All of those were violations of international law. Covert CIA operations in the country that have been going on forever. These are unlawful. These are violations of sovereignty. They're breaches of international law. And as if it has to be said out loud, the murder of boaters in the Caribbean, whether or not they're involved in drug trafficking, which clearly some of them at least were not, but even those that you say were involved in drug trafficking, by the way, to the Caribbean, not to the US and their small boats, that is unlawful. Those are extrajudicial execution under international human rights law. It's a grave violation of international law. The US blockade on Venezuela is unlawful, as has been repeatedly affirmed with these kinds of actions by the International Court of Justice. These are violations of international law. The really stunning arrogance of the US in pirating Venezuelan oil tankers, in stealing the resources, in ignoring the flagging of those ships, and of stating out loud in Trump's own voice that they intend to keep the ships and steal the oil. That is an act of maritime aggression under the UN Charter, under the law of the sea, and it's a violation also of legal principles of sovereign immunity. The bombing, the invasion, and by the way, the subsequent threats of further force, because the threat of the use of force is also a violation of the UN Charter. And the US has said repeatedly, if Venezuela doesn't do what we want, they're going to get more of this. And it has threatened other countries in the region and beyond, most notably recently Colombia, and of course Iran, where it's gearing up again to wage a bloody assault against the people of Iran. That's a violation of the Charter of the UN. The Charter is a treaty, and it is binding law on the United States, including in domestic law in the United States. And then obviously, flying in, murdering the guard, kidnapping the president and First Lady Celia Flores, these are violations of the Charter. They're violations of international human rights law, which prohibits arbitrary arrest and detention. And this is arbitrary arrest and detention. It violates an international legal principle called head of state immunity. Right? This is not, you cannot have a peaceful world order where everybody's flying around arresting each other's presidents, right? There are provisions in international tribunals like the International Criminal Court that would allow a head of state to be indicted and to be arrested, but you can't have individual countries arresting each other's leaders. It should be self-evident that this is not normal, but it's clearly not legal. And then you look at the violence that was used, right? We saw the images of Celia Flores, scarred and beaten and bruised and battered and with her ribs bandaged and her face bloodied. That violence, because it took place in an unlawful arrest, and because it was done so violently, those are individual violations of international law. They circulated photos of Maduro bound and blindfolded and earphoned and so on in a kind of global perp walk. That's a violation of international humanitarian law that prohibits precisely that kind of dissemination because it's an offense to the dignity of the prisoner. We saw in those images that they were intentionally imposing sensory deprivation with blindfolds and ear covers and so on. That also is unlawful under human rights and humanitarian law. And because his arrest, his abduction was unlawful, that means that they are committing further violations of international law with every day that they continue to hold him, because that's an act of arbitrary detention. And obviously the US has no legal defense. So it is simply ignoring international law, saying we're doing this because we can do it, and then purporting to deal with this under US national law. Imagine a world where any country could legislate against the people or the politicians or the institutions of another country, and then claim that they're acting in a lawful way when they do it. This is a complex of crimes being perpetrated by the US government and by individuals within the US government who, according to international law, should be held accountable. Have you heard that from corporate media? I don't think so.